This week we're making block number 6 for our summer sew along, and we're making this block, which is commonly called the shoe fly block. The shoe fly block is made up of 1 center square, 4 half square triangles, and 4 background fabric squares. So the instructions that are right here are what you'll need to make those blocks, but let's talk about them first. We're going to be using fabric A. Now fabric A appears in several of our blocks, and if you remember, we used it in block number 1. I know that this fabric is my fabric A because it's on my color chart, so I can go ahead and cut what's required here, but I probably don't have to cut those squares. If you remember back when we made block number 1, we made one 9-patch block, and it was fabric A and the background fabric. And you cut 1 strip 2.5 inches by the whole width of the fabric. Now you can cut 16 squares from a 40-inch usable width of fabric, and we only used 5 in our block. So if you cut the rest of that strip into squares, you'll have about 11 left over, and you need 8 for this set of blocks, so you can use the previous strip. Now if you can't find these, or you lost that strip, or you used it for something else, it doesn't matter because you've got plenty of fabric to be able to go back and cut those. So you can cut a strip the whole way across, and then you'll need 8 of the 2.5-inch squares of fabric A. And then the instructions also say to cut 1 strip 6.5 inches by the width of the fabric, but it has those 3 pink asterisks after it. That refers to this note. We're going to be making half square triangles for this block, and that cut is what I use if I'm using triangles on a roll. So I'm using the triangle paper, triangles on a roll, in the 2-inch finished size for this project. So if you're using a different product or using a different method to make your half square triangles, then you cut accordingly. So it says, if you're using another method, cut accordingly. And that means according to the instructions that came with your product. So if you're using something else, use those instructions. But if you're using the triangles on a roll, you're going to need 1 strip 6.5 inches by the width of the fabric, the full way across. Now when I cut my pieces for my triangles on a roll, I looked at my diagram and I know that we need 32 of these. All right, so we're going to need 32 half square triangles for our block. I also know that next week for block number 7, we're going to need another 16 of this exact same combination. So instead of just making some this week and next week, I'm going to go ahead and make all 48 half square triangles this week, and then they'll be ready to go. So if you would like to make 48 half square triangles, you'll use your width of fabric, the whole width of the fabric. I suggest that you cut it on the fold and then use your paper and make 24 at one time. So remember, each square makes 2, so that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and then 2 rows of squares would be 24. So I took my fabric and I cut it on the fold down here, and then I laid my paper on and measured it to give myself a little bit of a buffer, about an extra 1/4 of an inch there on the end. And I've mentioned this before, but I waste one of the squares in every cut that I make. I don't have a problem doing that because it makes me more efficient, and I like the way that my pieces come out because I'm sure that I have an exact cut on the end. But when I cut my fabric and my paper, I had this piece left over here. Now, you may have enough to do this, you may not, and it's not vital to the success of your quilt, but this is what I do. This is just a tip. So when I have this much fabric left over, I take one of my shop rulers, this is from Calico Cats, and I cut that 2.5-inch strip, and then I'll turn the ruler and cut as many 2.5-inch squares as I can get. Now I may use those in this quilt, but I may not need them. Little scraps like this, I cut into 2.5-inch squares, and then I store them in a silverware holder. They fit right in there and they're stacked up. So when I want to make a scrap quilt using 2.5-inch squares, I have a whole bunch pre-cut for me. So that's not part of our quilt, but it's just one of those tips for how I do things. Now, in order to make my half square triangles, you'll see on your instruction sheet that if you want to review the video tips for the tips that I gave you for how I'd use this product, they're in block number 3. So you can go back to block number 3 video and watch all of the details about how to use triangles on a roll. But what we want to do is I want to take my 2 layers of fabric here and separate them. I want to make sure that they're right sides together. So right side to right side here. Line up my raw edges. I'm going to flip this over so the lightest fabric is on the top. That helps me when I'm pressing my seams to the dark. And then I'm going to put my paper on here, and I'm not going to pin it in place. I'm going to use my clips to put it on here. And I find that that helps me keep it laying flat, where pins tend to ripple and pucker a little bit in my experience. Now also, you can see that I've cut it in half. So I'm making 24 at a time. We'll need a total of 48 to finish this week's block and for next week's block. So if we have 48, 24 at a time is easier to control at my sewing machine rather than a great big long 40-inch piece of fabric that I'm trying to maneuver and turn with all of these quick turns. I'll go, after I've clipped this together, I'll go sew, reduce my stitch length, sew on the dotted lines, cut on the solid lines, and I'll have all of my half square triangles ready to go. So once they're sewn together like this, I cut the outside edge first, and then I cut the sides, and then I'll cut my verticals and horizontals, and then I'll cut the diagonals. The reason I have you cut the diagonals last is because if your ruler slips on this angle, it doesn't really matter because it's in the seam allowance. But this vertical line and this horizontal line establishes the size of your half square triangles. So you want to make sure those are 100% accurate, right? So now, this information on your instruction sheet tells you how to use the triangles on a roll to make your half square triangles. Once you've done that, you're ready to put your blocks together. And these are super easy blocks to put together. Your triangles point in. You have a center square that's just a solid square. And then you put it together in rows. Press your seams towards the darker fabric or away from the background fabric. And then sew your rows together matching those seams. And your block will look just like this. So we have the triangles on the corners, the center square, and the rest of the fabric is background. And all of our blocks, every block in this quilt measures 6.5 inches from raw edge to raw edge in both directions. If your blocks are not coming out the right size, then hopefully you've either adjusted your seam allowance, your pressing technique, or you're checking your rulers to make sure that they're accurate. Now, when I press my seams, I'm a big proponent of pressing your seams open and then to one side. But I know a lot of you like to just roll your seams back. When you roll your seams back, you want to make sure, it's okay to do that, you just want to make sure that it's open the entire way and that there's no places where it didn't quite get pushed open the whole way. So make sure that you're doing all of your seams that way. Now if you want your seams, if your blocks are coming out just a tiny scant too small, then try pressing your seams open on the back. So you press them open and then to one side, and that will help extend the block just slightly because that little hump that happens right there takes up a thread or two. So if you press your seam open and then to one side, the hump is now in the seam allowance and you get the full face of your fabric. So I know that sometimes when I give tips and suggestions like this, you probably look at the other person in the room with you and go, that woman's crazy. And that's okay. I'm just telling you tips and ideas for how to make your sewing more successful. If you have a way that works for you and everything's coming out the right size, then I applaud you. Do it your way. You don't have to do it my way. I'm just giving suggestions.